Hello, my name is Amber, and this is the first episode of You Look Like a Badger, my monthly film podcast about queer cinema. I'm very excited to make a start on it. So it's January, and the theme for this month is We Have Always Lived in the Shadows, queer-themed historical fiction. And the first film that we are starting with is The Favourite.
You will dismiss her. I don't want to. I like it when she puts her tongue inside me.
The Favourite is a 2018 film directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. Written by Deborah Davis, is her first writing credit apparently, and the creator of the Hulu series The Great, Tony McNamara. I hope I'm saying that correctly. It tells the story of Queen Anne, played by Olivia Colman, as she is pulled in multiple directions by two women who are attempting to use her power for their own gain. Sarah Churchill, played by Rachel Weisz, leverages her relationship with Anne with the intent of political gain, and Abigail Masham, played by Emma Stone, who wishes to inflate her status and remove herself from being a peasant. So she seduces the Queen in order to do this. This film is laden with historical inaccuracies and is rife with Lanthimos' trademark dry and stilted performances. As a result, the film feels almost out of time, despite insisting on its 18th century aesthetic. The sharp performances and even sharper script allow for an incredibly thrilling story, where you aren't sure who you're rooting for, but you know inevitably someone terrible has to win the title of the titular favourite. This film won a lot of awards, a Wikipedia page full of awards, including an Oscar and a BAFTA for Olivia Colman as Best Actress. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 92% critic score and a 69% yes, audience score. It has a 4 on Letterboxd. So this film was received generally very positively. I'm gonna do a segment, we'll see if I keep it up, where I'm gonna read some of the most popular reviews on Letterboxd. The most popular reviews on Letterboxd are from these users. User Sammy writes, what the actual fuck? Which, that is a reaction that I also had the first time I watched it. They go on to say that they loved the complex characters and dynamics explored, the sharp and smart dialogue, the cinematography, production design, and visuals were, simply put, lush and indulging treats. Don't even get me started on Olivia, Emma, and Rachel's performances. Having loved those three bitches, I owe them my life. This movie made me laugh and cry, and in conclusion, this was some good shit. Another review that made me laugh was by user Kate, who wrote, "Can you imagine being a fucking rabbit and just sitting there watching the literal Queen of England watching the literal Queen of England bottom for Rachel Weisz every single night?" Yeah, I mean, okay. This is where I'm going to give my spoiler warning, because I know people get a bit weird about spoilers on the internet. I personally like to be warned if a podcast is going to just spoil the whole film. I'm not going to relay the plot, but I am going to talk about the film in detail, and that will spoil it for a lot of people, because I'm going to have to talk about specific plot points and the ending, which is very important to what I want to discuss here. So this is your spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the film, I would recommend going and watching it before you listen to this podcast. Okay, because we're going to get right into it. So I discussed earlier how the film is deliberately historically inaccurate. It goes out of its way to be inaccurate, and that's mainly through the style. I mean, it seems like it would be important for a historical fictional film to try and tell us something about history, but that doesn't seem to be what the film wants to do here. I did look up how much of the film was accurate, just because I was curious. So this is what I found. As portrayed in the film, Sarah and Anne really did grow up together, and they were very close for much of their lives. During Anne's reign, Sarah exerted political influence over the Queen, who, according to a biography by the historian Anne Somerset, was not well educated in matters of the state. I also found out that Anne did not have a pet rabbit for each of her 17 deceased children. During the 18th century, rabbits were considered to be foodstuff or pests. I also found out Abigail did not poison Sarah. It's a very significant plot point in the film. It's an event that deliberately drives Sarah and Anne apart, but it was made up for the film. Just completely made up. It was there to get Sarah out of the palace. Nonetheless, the real Sarah was frequently absent from the court for long periods of time, which did piss off Anne. These absences allowed Abigail to seek and earn Anne's favour. The most sensational element of the film involves the sexual nature of Anne's relationships with Sarah and Abigail. I'm quoting from an article that I found on Time, by the way, and I will link everything that I've read in the show notes. Most historians maintain that it was unlikely that Anne was physically intimate with either of them. The real Sarah did threaten to blackmail Anne with personal letters penned to her, many of which expressed romantic sentiments towards Sarah. I think what we can discern from the film's desire to be historically inaccurate is a desire to just be more creative with the source material. Often history is quite dull. It's not nearly as exciting as stories often are. Similarly, history can't be as explicitly queer as we can today. Now, there is a lot of secrecy in the film. Obviously, a main plot point is the threat of Anne's queerness being made public, but we are shown queerness just on screen right there. There isn't any secrecy for the audience. We know that Anne is in love with Sarah and that she has a lot of affection for Abigail. We know that Sarah is in love with Anne. We are unsure what Abigail actually feels because she seems to be using Anne's desire for her to get what she wants. I'll get onto that later. In being ahistorical, the filmmakers don't have to hint or subtly imply queerness because everything in the film is so ostentatious, is so out of time, is so out of history, the queerness can be as well. Now, I'm going to talk about the lesbian period drama because it's quite a contentious issue on the internet. People are not a fan of the oversaturation of films containing queer ladies set in a historical period that are very sad and tragic. They are very chaste, they're usually very white, and they usually have a sad ending. According to an article that I found in Collider, the film Carol 2015 seems to have been the start of this trend, at least the recent trend of lesbian films set in the past. I have a full list of other films that have come out recently that have all been period dramas about queer women. I haven't watched all of these, but I have watched some of them. And I will get onto it in a second, but I will just read you the list. So we have Carol, we have The Handmaiden, Love and Friendship, Wild Nights with Emily, Lizzie, Vita and Virginia, Colette, Gentleman Jack, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, The World to Come, and Ammonite. Now, I can't personally say that I hate these films. I'm hesitant to dismiss a whole genre, but it is interesting that there are so many lesbian period dramas. It does seem quite strange as to, I think a lot of that seems to just be down to if Hollywood, if the industry sees that a film is doing well, they will keep making more of that film. I mean, I don't know if it probably is more complex than that, but in my personal opinion, that seems to be what it is. I mean, I'm not an expert. I did read up on it, and I sort of gathered other people's opinions. The Collider article that I read that cited Carol as the beginning of this trend said that 18th century films specifically have the room to grow stories around the depiction of societal structures at the time and what that meant for female relationships. Protagonists operate behind closed doors, not because they are necessarily ashamed, but more so afraid of what will happen if the men they've married learn about these affairs. Now, that last sentence probably doesn't apply too much to the favourite because Anne's husband is entirely absent from this film he's not even mentioned really, like at all. I mean, we assume that he existed because we learn of Anne's pregnancies, but we don't know about him. We don't know if he's alive or dead. We have to assume he's dead, but we don't know. I think, see, I'm reading over my notes about the research that I did about lesbian period dramas. So much of what I learned, the favourite just diverts from so much. So I read an article in Screen Queens. I'm just going to read you a quote from that, and we'll see how much applies to the favourite. There is almost a preordained association with tragedy in these films, as the audience walks into the theatre knowing that these women will likely not end up together. Indeed, among many, both queer and straight, there is often still an unconscious association between queerness and tragedy, and these period pieces allow this association to play out without much criticism. Because it is automatically assumed that the past was more homophobic and sexist than the present, tragedy often feels like both the natural and the accurate ending of these films. Whilst I would argue that the ending of The Favourite is tragic, I wouldn't describe The Favourite as a tragedy. I don't know if it's me, maybe I'm just not clued into what a tragedy even is. Maybe I'm a moron, I'm not sure. This film definitely falls into more of like a black comedy. I don't think I'd describe it as a tragedy, mainly because it presents its more sorrowful and tragic moments in a very light and satirical way. This is not a two women stare longingly across a room at each other, but they're not allowed to touch and kiss. Everyone's wearing petticoats, you know. It's a very different tone. It takes a very different tone. But the statement that I will agree on, this film is guilty of, is from the Screen Queens article that I just read. The last and most consistently relevant criticism of lesbian period pieces is that they are almost always white. Which, yes, is unfortunately very, very true. I can't really refute that. What I'd probably push up against is that this film diverts from many of the tropes that are associated with lesbian period dramas, that they're very slow and boring, and they contain a lot of women just looking at each other. This film is exciting. It's distinct in its style and its method of portraying romance and desire and sex. It feels like a game. It feels like betrayal is just constantly happening. It feels like the political is so central to the story, but it's also very marginal to the way these women are just destroying one another. I am next going to talk about Olivia Colman, who does an excellent job. Just fucking fantastic. She's great. She rightfully won an Oscar for her performance, but this does bring up a second contentious issue on the internet, knocking them all down today, which is, should a straight person, one, take on queer roles, and two, win awards for those queer roles? Again, I don't think we're going to answer that question fully here, but it's still worth discussing, I think. See, it is tricky, right? Because in a vacuum, obviously, anyone should be able to play any role, and ideally, the best person for the role should get that part. But the reality is that movies are made based on star power, and the people cast in them are those who studios think are going to make the most money. And most famous people, at least publicly, are heterosexual and they are cisgender. That's just the truth. And they're the ones who are going to sell your film. It's a very sad truth, but queer actors often don't get to portray queer characters, so they don't get to win awards for it. I even have some numbers to back up my claims. The number of outwardly LGBTQ+ characters who've earned their portrayers Oscar nominations since 2002, which stands a staggering 36 at least. That's an average of nearly 2 per year. And none of them were played by openly LGBTQ+ actors. Jeremy Blacklow, the director of entertainment media at GLAAD, says LGBTQ+ actors have long faced blatant employment discrimination and have felt forced to hide their sexual orientation or gender identity if they hope to work at all. Once they come out as lesbian, gay, and bisexual, actors have rarely been considered for straight leading roles, and they haven't been cast for leading lesbian, gay, or bisexual roles either. Today, if a cisgender actor is cast in a transgender role, the significant outcry from transgender people and their allies makes the project untenable. See, on this issue, I I'm not really sure what the compromise would be. Because, of course, I want queer actors to get queer roles, but I also don't want queer people to have to come out in order to do their job. You see what I'm talking about when I say this issue is very tricky. It's a very weird issue, because it's not like homophobia and transphobia isn't like terribly rampant. It's still illegal to ask about someone's identification at a job interview or audition, and some queer actors feel like they don't feel like they're not ready to disclose their gender identity or sexual orientation in the workplace. However, there are still openly queer people who are good at acting, even. Like I said, we weren't going to solve this issue on this podcast, but it is worth considering the performance as well. If the performance is offensive or terribly stereotypical, then yes, I think it would be worth being highly critical. But I think in this particular case, Olivia Colman plays the role very sensitively, and she's also just a very good actress. So I personally, in this instance, I don't really have a problem with Olivia Colman winning this award. It would be nice if a very famous lesbian got to play a very famous lesbian and then won an Oscar for it. I'm very happy for when that day comes, but it wasn't in 2018, so, you know. So, shall we dig into the film? That would be good. I feel like we haven't discussed it really. Talked about it being historically inaccurate and Olivia Colman. So, let's talk about gender.
My father always spoke highly of you. I liked your father. He had charm to burn. And I guess he did. You have fallen far.
When I was 15, my father lost me in a card game.
You are not serious.
This one here.
Oh, he was very upset about it. Took off into the forest with nothing but a scullery maid and a dozen bottles for solace.
And you went?
I wanted to do right by my father. The debt was to a balloon-shaped German man with a thin cock. Thankfully, I managed to convince him a woman has her blood in 28 days a month.
This film very famously passes the anti-Bechdel test, which is not a thing. If you don't know, the Bechdel test it's a measure of representation that was that was created by Alison Bechdel. I'm pretty sure as a joke, but people take it very seriously. So it's basically a test that you can use when watching a film, that if there is a scene where two named female characters have a conversation that is not about a man, then it passes the Bechdel test. Right. So this film passes the anti-Bechdel test because it has two named male characters having a discussion about a duck rather than the female characters, because outside of that conversation there is no conversation happening on screen that isn't about women, which I personally love. I do think it's interesting how strange the gender dynamics are in this film. The men in the film are ridiculous. We're not meant to take them seriously at all. And this is in spite of the fact that they make up the political majority. They're really the only ones who are allowed to, they would have been the only ones allowed to vote, and they're the only ones in parliament, but in no way are we meant to take what they're doing, what their plight is, seriously. They have like duck races, they throw fruit at naked men, and all of these games that they play, all the ridiculousness makes them oblivious to the fact that Sarah is essentially running the country in place of the Queen. No one seems to be the wiser, really, of Sarah and Anne's relationship either. The fact that Sarah could blackmail Anne about her queerness is quite baffling, really, because none of the men seem particularly invested in what the women do. And that really is the crux of it, isn't it? They don't care what the women are doing. They just don't care. They don't see it as important. I think one of my favourite scenes that just, it might be one of the best scenes in film ever. Abigail, it's her wedding night, and her husband, Masham, is like, I would like to have sex. And Abigail is like, I'm doing some scheming, can you leave me alone? And Masham is like, no. So she gives him the least enthusiastic handjob, all while just talking out loud to herself about Anne and about Sarah, and that really is just the thesis of the film. Distract the men whilst we do some fucking evil hijinks, which is vastly more interesting than whatever war is going on, than whatever business the men are doing. It's just not interesting. It's not presented as interesting. An article in Vox said, the men of The Favourite frequently come off as ludicrous. Their political concerns are incidental to the real drama unfolding between the three women. Also, the blurred gender roles are really emphasised through costume design, through how people behave. Harley, another excellent... This film is excellent, but it has excellent scenes. So Sarah makes fun of Harley by saying that his mascara is running. And isn't that just a very absurd sentence? Because of course 18th century men were wearing makeup. The skin was peeling off due to syphilis. They had to. But yeah, the women pass their time by shooting and fucking, and the men wear makeup and they race ducks and they throw fruit at naked men. Whenever Anne is made to dress up, to be hyper feminine, to wear what a queen is meant to wear, she looks out of place. I would also just like to give an aside to Sarah's shooting clothes. They're wonderful. I would like to give thanks to whoever designed them. Thank you very much. I'm glad I got to see them. Let's talk about how queerness is used and exploited for political gain.
Sarah, you must say hello to the little ones.
No. It is macabre.
Please.
No. I love you, but that I will not do.
If you love me,
Love has limits.
it should not.
We are going to talk about Abigail because she is significant, obviously. She is there to drive a wedge between Sarah and Anne, and also raise her status from being a peasant to being a lady again. Abigail exploits the queen's naive nature in order to gain upward mobility. We see throughout the film that she is constantly watching. She's constantly observing. She, often during conversations, the camera will cut back to her looking. She's looking at how people are behaving and she's gathering information on them to be used against them later. Now, in filmic language, this can be seen to convey how she lives on the outskirts. She remains lower class, and it's not until she's able to move to the centre she stops observing, that she stops sneaking in on people's conversations. She begins in a place of innocence. We assume kindness. We don't know much about her, but she seems fairly kind and she seems to have a genuine interest in Anne, and then becomes corrupted as she has to do more and more evil things to acquire standing in court. We hear her state that she is on her side always. This is very different to Sarah, who, yes, is also trying to gain political power, but she cares about Anne. She prioritizes Anne. The final scene of the film is strange and ambiguous, but what we see is a simultaneous realization between Anne and Abigail. Abigail sees how she has been corrupted and that this is her life now. She must now care for Anne for forever. She must now keep up this routine if she wishes to keep her standing. And Anne, after completely dismissing Sarah, after her gout gets much worse, and after she has had a stroke, is fully reliant on Abigail. Their relationship is codependent. The power that Abigail had from her queerness is fully out of her hands, and so is Anne's. She is no longer able to move the way she used to, and figuratively, neither is Abigail.
I'm ready for the Russian ambassador.
Who did your makeup?
We went for something dramatic. Do you like it?
You look like a badger.
Now, all this is vastly contrasted with Sarah, who, whilst, yes, she does want political power and she does essentially run the country, her love for Anne is genuine. And because it is genuine, it is honest, even when it comes across as cruel. The scene where Sarah tells Anne that she looks like a badger, Sarah convinces Anne not to meet with the Russians based on how she looks. She's very straightforward, and she explicitly says, "I do not play games with you." This is in contrast to Abigail, who consistently plays games. We learn that Sarah repeatedly saves Anne. It's actually how they met. There's a whole story about how Sarah stopped Anne from being spat on by a boy. Sarah knows how to ease Anne's gout pain. She knows that Anne shouldn't have hot chocolate or lots of sugar because it makes her ill. Again, she says all of this very cruelly. She's not a very kind person, but she does care. Unfortunately, Anne has a very different view of how she should be loved. She wants Sarah to drop everything and be with her at all moments. And Sarah wants England to be a country that's run well. They have very different desires, which is where Abigail comes in. Sarah doesn't want to play with Anne's rabbits because she thinks it's morbid that Anne has rabbits that represent her dead children. Abigail will happily play with Anne's rabbits if it means that Abigail gets closer to Anne. Sarah doesn't dance with Anne at her ball, and which makes Anne very mad, and she asks to leave. But Abigail offers to dance with Anne in her quarters. Abigail essentially fills in where Sarah won't, but this is to Anne's downfall, unfortunately. Anne's desire to be loved unconditionally with no limits stops her from seeing when she's being exploited for her power. Sarah says, "I am not food. You cannot just eat and eat." Their relationship isn't reciprocal. Anne just wants to take and take and take, and because of this, she drives Sarah away. So we'll answer the question, does this film look like a badger? So in my opinion, I think, and this is just my opinion, this is one of the most interesting queer films I've ever seen in the modern day. I have watched a lot, so, but it's so complex and funny and very toxic and problematic, and that makes it so much more interesting. It doesn't feel like it's trying to pander to anyone. It's presenting a very toxic, codependent love triangle, and it's using it as a way to convey political corruption in the 18th century in England. It talks about the way affection and desire, and more importantly queerness, is manipulated for the sake of power. It's performed excellently. It looks amazing. I love watching it. It's so funny. In my opinion, I know it has the line, "You look like a badger," and that's what this podcast is based on, but I legitimately believe that this does not look like a badger. It's so far from a badger. I've said badger too many times now, it doesn't sound like a word. Okay, if you like this film, what else should you watch? I have 3 recommendations for you. If you are after a queer period drama, I would recommend The Handmaiden. This is one of my favourite films of all time, and yeah, I love getting people to watch it, I think. Because I just think it's excellent. It's kind of similar, in that it is a wealthy woman and her handmaid, and exploration of their queerness. Betrayal, it's got plot twists. I'm not going to reveal too much about it because I prefer, particularly with this film, I'd prefer if you went into it blind and you didn't know anything about it. If you liked Tony McNamara's writing style, because he did write the script for this, then I would also recommend The Great. I think it's on Hulu. It's about Catherine the Great and her husband Peter, how she came to get the throne. It's very funny. It's very dark. It's a period piece. So if what you're after is people dressing up in old-time clothing, then yes, watch The Great. Now, if what you liked about this film was the sort of stilted acting, the very weird camera movements and directing, then I would recommend watching The Lobster. I think that's Yorgos Lanthimos' most popular film. I feel like it's the one that most people know. I will give a brief description of it. Set in an alternative universe where basically monogamy and love are mandatory. So you must be in a relationship. And it follows this man as he basically tries to become married so that he is not turned into an animal for the rest of his life. Can you guess what animal he picks to be turned into if he fails his task? Is it might be a lobster. Yeah, I'm not going to say more than that. It's a weird film. It's a lot weirder than this one, but like I said, you've probably heard of it and have watched it. But yeah, I would watch The Lobster if you haven't seen it. Okay, thank you. This is the end of the podcast now. Thank you very much for listening to my first podcast episode. I am hoping to keep this up because I have enjoyed the process of doing this. I hope that my next episode is in February, and the theme for that month is going to be Queering the Heart, and we're going to be looking at romantic films. If you want to stay updated, for trailers and clips, you can follow me on Twitter at @LikeABadgerPod, and you can also follow me on Spotify. I have also made a YouTube channel where I'll be uploading the podcast as well. So you can subscribe to that if you like. If you're interested in me as a person, that's a bit weird, but if you want to read more of my work, because I write about films a lot, so if you want to read more of my work, you can find my writing at ambercanwalk.com. If you would, for any reason, like to give me money, you can if you want. You listen to this and you're like, yes, I'd like to give you money. You can donate to my coffee, which I will put in the show notes. As I said earlier, I'm going to put all the sources that I found in the show notes as well, if you want to read more. So yeah, thank you again for listening, and I hope to be back in February. Bye!